Greetings and welcome back to another discussion. Today I am joined by guests with a good amount of knowledge of modern and early modern history, and we're going to be discussing the true history, as it were, of the so-called founding fathers, or as I would like to call it, the myths behind these mythological figures, so to speak, because they do have those qualities to them. Not the myths that are propagated in the current year culture that they're all, well, I don't need to say it out loud explicitly. We all know what the current culture and current year people would claim they were. And also not the sort of freedom-loving freedom fighters who founded a nation for the sake of liberty and justice for all or some such nonsense. No, I think the reality looks quite different. So I guess the first question I would ask my guests is, the founding fathers, I don't even like that term, but the founding fathers, the Benjamin Franklins, the George Washingtons, the Thomas Jeffersons, the James Madison, these are almost mythical, hero-like figures, at least in theory, in American history. And they're often portrayed as having wholly benign intentions and just really wanting the best for all by laying down the groundwork for a constitutional republic and blah, blah, blah. And frankly, I never really bought it. But I think you can offer us a history lesson to really fill in the gaps of why that's not the case.
Thanks for having me on. Yeah, great as always. When it comes to historical figures, the founding fathers, compared to others, are certainly not the worst you'd ever encounter. But what you'll find is that they were, in the grand scheme of historical figures, actually quite ordinary. And scholarship in recent decades has definitely, thankfully, taken a more balanced, if not pessimistic, look at them. And so, yeah, I would agree with you that maybe they're not worthy of demigod worthy worship, but they're certainly obviously not terrible people either. Just as a brief headline, a brief overview of it, in academia, certainly not taught in the mainstream standard educational system. The founding fathers of the United States, you could classify their revolution and their movement really as a plutocratic power grab. Uh, and speaking very generally before we dive in deep, if you take a look at the scholarship and even the primary source documents on this issue, the founding fathers' motives were quite commercial and economic and self-centered. Speaking very generally, the founding fathers all, for the most part, came from the wealthy, either landed or mercantile classes in major centers of commerce and power in the 13 colonies and the surrounding regions. And so we're taught in school, and a lot of attention is given to, the selflessness and the virtue and the ideals of liberty of people. For example, you hear a lot about Thomas Paine, Paul Revere, but frankly, these two were, physical and ideological supporters of the revolution, but in the aftermath, they certainly did not benefit from it, and they weren't included as much as later people would have liked into the foundation of the nation, the framing of the Constitution. Thomas Paine famously spent inordinate amount of time suffering with the Continental Army, publishing many pamphlets and keeping up morale, but later it can be inferred from his writings and what he said that he felt the revolution was almost betrayed. So, yeah, speaking very generally, I would say you're right in terms of the historical consensus these days is that uh, the American Revolution is not what is taught in school.
Yeah, and it's also not what the current year culture would claim. I mean, they really have a misunderstanding of virtually all history. But I certainly remember as a younger person just being taught a sense of artificial reverence for this time period and what these men had achieved. Of course, above all, the formulation of the American Constitution, this sacred, almost holy document. And I suppose as I got older, I had to just assume that they didn't have the benign intentions that are often attributed to them just because it's just not human nature. People, if you're fighting for quote unquote freedom, there must be a reason why you're fighting for it. I mean, barring maybe Spartacus or what have you, but there has to be some underlying motive behind the, yeah, let's wage a revolutionary war and found a new nation beyond simply the desire for freedom and prosperity for all, you know?
Yeah, if I may interject, you'll find just across history in multiple nations and empires of all sorts, the wealthy classes of a society, if they're doing well under the system, rarely stick out their necks for the lower orders. And there's no exception of this in the American Revolution. So, for example, if you just do a quick roundup of the major founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, John Jay, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, these were not people coming from the lower orders, and for whatever reason, and it's probably too much to get into, they were on the short end of the stick, commercially speaking, in the decades leading up to the Revolutionary War. So, for example, Benjamin Franklin, right? So he started off as the son of, I think, a soap maker and candle maker. He wasn't rich, but he became rich much later because he really he came into his own in the Philadelphia merchant society. George Washington is the second one. He was, I would say, partially aristocratic, but he was a landholder and something. And in that day and age, that was quite a social achievement. Same with John Adams as well. He's actually probably the most aristocratic of all of the colonists. You think? I
Yeah.
think he was the fifth generation descendant of one of the founding families of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He's a Puritan deacon, and his family was very, very well established. I think he was a lawyer. Otherwise, he was a major public figure. Thomas Jefferson, huge landholder back then. I think he had plantations. Same with John Jay. He was the son of wealthy merchants. I don't need to go down the whole roster, but you see uh, a shared common background of people who actually were leading in the Continental Congress, the Constitution, not people like Paul Revere and
Thomas
uh,
Paine.
Thomas Paine. Yes, thank you. And I'll do a quick overrun of what was happening leading up to the revolution and their commercial motives, right? So during the Revolutionary War, or before the Revolutionary War, I should say, the British made an arrangement with the Native Americans, the Indians, the various tribes and groups they had, because as the colonists were expanding out towards the Appalachian Mountains, there was sporadic conflict with the Native Americans as they were, encroaching and settling and colonizing the land, and stationing troops and putting it up in forts and dealing with this semi-insurgent warfare happening all the time with a mix between civilians, irregular soldiers, and the natives was expensive. So they reached a deal. I think it was called the Compromise or Proclamation of 1763. And what it did is it established a boundary that none of the colonists could settle beyond, I should say. And to the British credit, they respected that deal very, very strongly. Um, Colonists were punished for attempting to cross over and settle beyond that line. Now, it's too much to get into during this talk, but Benjamin Franklin in particular had massive commercial interests in subleasing and letting up that land in the Appalachians to settle. There was a huge amount of money could be made doing that, as we all obviously know. And same thing with all the people in the Boston, Philadelphia, New England Merchant Society. They had huge shipping and commercial interests, and this is well known and even intuitively understood. If you're an American shipper, you want the best of all worlds, right? So you want the protection of the British Navy, but you don't like the port restrictions, right? If you want to trade with the Spanish, you want to trade with the Spanish, the French, everyone else. You want free port entry in the Caribbean and Europe. That just wasn't possible under the British system, which everyone knows was mercantilist at the time. Um, and couple that on top of the legitimate complaints they did have about political representation, right? They felt like they were aristocracy, they were landed, they were wealthy, but they were second tier as people in the colonies, and certainly they were the top of the society in the colonies, but they were shut out as part of the overall British system. So I think I've built the case now that there were massive, massive commercial and economic incentives for the founding fathers to fight for. And if you look at even what happened in the wake of the revolution, you can find some pretty interesting shenanigans going on. It'll take a moment for me to pull up the documents, but when I read it, it'll be quite fascinating. If you could stall for a moment while I find that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's really what this is about ultimately. Getting at the heart of the matter with the founding fathers beyond the hoopla la. I mean, for example, stupid things like George Washington secretly cut down a cherry tree, and he couldn't lie to his father. It probably almost certainly never happened. And also the benign intentions. I mean, I would say some of the founding fathers, clearly, I think Jefferson, primarily amongst them, were sort of intellectuals. Jefferson, I probably would argue, was the smartest amongst them, probably the most learned. But, and Benjamin Franklin to a lesser degree, too. But, yeah, well, I'll mention this later, but I think there's something that every nation and generally speaking, sort of cultural, geographical area goes through, and that they try to lionize some or figures or try to glorify some foundational myth to add authenticity and to legitimate the subsequent history as it rolls on. And I think the United States is another such example. And it's interesting, when we talk about sort of coastal interest, that you have something, well, you mentioned the major cities like Philadelphia and particularly Boston, New York, what have you.
New England
New
proper in
England, New
general.
England, right, where you have the situation of, well, essentially coastal elites. It's a bit different since there were no,
That was
seven,
true back then too.
yeah, minus the West Coast, since that was not as yet properly settled, to the best of my knowledge, at least by the Anglo Saxons. But yeah, I mean, I think we're going to see actually in the process of discussing this some real similarity between the current year situation and even back then.
I have the historical research here from Charles Beard, and he concluded that the founders, quote, immediately, directly, and personally derived economic advantages from the revolution and the new government under the Constitution. And it says here that the basis for some of Beard's startling conclusions were that U.S. Treasury records showed that 40 of the 55 founders held federal bonds that were later sold back to the government for much more than they cost. Beard also pointed out that the founders were generally wealthy individuals engaged in shipbuilding and other commercial ventures, including money lending, speculation on the Western lands, slavery, and the slave trade. All of these enterprises, Beard claimed, would be far more profitable with a central government capable of establishing a uniform currency, enforcing trade treaties, protecting its commercial shipping, and pushing the British and Indians off of Western lands.
Yeah. Yeah, so now we're getting a bit of insight into the actual motivations behind a lot of this. I've no doubt that there was some ideological chafing at being under the crown, but I'm not sure if that was truly the underlying reason for starting it all off. Yeah. And do you think, though, that that's a reasonable hypothesis that their motivations ultimately were based upon, well, rent seeking and the idea that if they could just get away from the crown, they'd be able to increase their profits significantly?
Yeah, not only is that the historical consensus, but again, we have primary source documentation of this. Most of the founding fathers in the wake of the revolution became significantly more wealthy and powerful than they ever were before. Now, you can argue, obviously, that this might have been due to the loss of autonomy under the British, or the loss of the British control over them, but also at the same time, too. I mean, we can establish clear, documented lines of successful commercial ventures they undertook or various other money schemes that significantly enriched them after the revolution. And you can see this also in their actions afterwards as well. So there were many very, very prominent and famous farmers' revolts, soldiers' revolts, and all sorts of revolts after the revolution, which were calling upon the ideals that they had set forward in the Declaration of Independence and the other revolutionary rhetoric, and they were all violently put down. And only a few cases were those people forgiven. So a lot of those revolts had to do with debt payments and owed money to soldiers, right? So they considered a lot of these farmers to be indebted. It's a very complicated situation, but they were indebted to their tax obligations that simply could not have been paid. And people make the arguments that after the revolution was done, they entrapped a lot of farmers or the lower orders of the colonies in these really, really devastating debt and taxation schemes and milk them dry to the point of, again, there were massive uprisings, destructive uprisings in the wake of the revolution that took decades to figure out and deal with.
Interesting. That's certainly not something you learn in, well, at least elementary school, and probably also not in high school.
Yeah, no, the headline of that is that the United States, in the wake of the revolution, obviously with a hint of liberty, right? So obviously, if you're a plutocrat leading a plutocrat's revolution, you need to enlist the support of the lower orders to succeed in attacking the very top of the system, in this case, the British. So they did that by offering temporary promises of liberty, autonomy, that were all eventually overturned with the Federalist, anti-Federalist movements, and the change from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution. And you can see the seeds planted of how the United States became the country it is today, which many people, I think, rightfully argue that the United States is little more than an economic zone with a paint job on the top of it, and it's a great country to be if you're commercially savvy and you're wealthy. There are a lot of things you can get access to, luxuries and other opportunities that you can't get in other countries, but is it really great for the lowest order? Is it great for all people? Is it a country made for all people? No, it's made for a
Well,
country for people who have wealth and can attract it.
yeah, you know what I like to say? One of the best things about the United States is calorie-free dressing. I can't get it here in Europe.
Yeah,
But
that is great, but that's also a product.
yeah, but I'm in complete agreement with you, and it's interesting connecting the dots. I mean, there's a kind of conflict of perception. I think there's this idea that the consumerist American society, as it's both portrayed and actually is and exists in its current state, is somehow a kind of recent development. Maybe in the last 30, maybe really generous, push it 50 years. But before that, the United States was a wholesome and spiritual place, and it had assigned value beyond the commercial. But by explaining the history, we're really seeing a sort of a continuity going all the way back to the so-called founding fathers of ascribing really the most important to commercial enterprise and just, well, effectively consumerism, even though it might not have been called that back then. So sort of the groundwork being laid there. And I'd argue also what it would also do that would be not planting sufficient seeds for a common and comprehensive identity, because the problem with consumerism is that it doesn't really give you anything but the byproducts, the highs, the pleasure of the products themselves. Nobody feels particularly aligned to that or has a common sense of identity. And it's sort of, I've mentioned this before, the political scientist Robert Kagan, to be American is to pay taxes and live in the United States and not commit any crimes. Okay, so that's not a lot to go on. Neither is getting, low calorie, low fat donuts. It might be great. And yeah, absolutely. I think it's almost undeniable, though some people would argue otherwise, that the United States is best for very wealthy people. I know this is, for a lot of people, though, the bristle hearing it. They say, oh, that sounds like a leftist talking point, but it is pretty factual. If you're middle class or below, it's going to be quite a struggle. And on top of that, if something goes awry and there are health issues, on the other hand, if you're wealthy, I mean, it's sort of your oyster. There are all kinds of lovely dressings you can buy, and you can go to supermarkets and get pre-peeled eggs and all this great stuff. But it's all just consumption. There's nothing beyond that. And it's interesting that, I mean, the melting pot thing came a lot later, and it was foreign influence, so to speak. But the fact that there's a myriad of sort of many different cultures over I guess now over 2 centuries plus that have emerged, I think has always been underpinned by the fact that the United States is primarily a commercial zone, as you put it, or an economic zone. It's not. There's nothing really cultural going on there per se. I mean, there are some things, Protestant work ethic and what have you. But
That's unavoidable. I mean, it's
yeah,
it's impossible to not have a culture.
yeah,
Yeah, if I may interject, yeah, I'll go out on a limb and make a very definitive statement. I consider the American Revolution, which, by the way, I'm not particularly, you know, biased or aggrieved against it, but just speaking from his historical perspective, I consider it to be a plutocratic power grab, and we're still feeling the shockwaves of it today. The fact is, a lot of the founders made a killing using the Continental Army and the United States Army to seize land towards the Appalachians and even further west of the line the British set up to respect treaties with the Native Americans. And they made a killing seizing that land federally and with the states, and then selling it and subleasing it out to settlers, farmers, and everyone else. They made a ton of money getting treasuries and flipping it and doing other various financial schemes in New England with all the other moneyed and landed people. And once again, we're still feeling the ramifications of that today with the wealth concentration in those areas and everything else. Another example of how, for example, how this issue is portrayed in your basic history class and before undergraduate education versus what actually happened. I guarantee more people are familiar with the Boston Tea Party and the taxes on teas, which is a very desperate final tax before many previous taxes, versus the Stamp Act, which maybe a lot of you have heard of, but you don't understand the ramifications of it most likely. So the Stamp Act in particular was a tax on certain documents that merchants would have needed to be compliant with trade, import, and export in the colonies in the British system. So that tax in particular almost exclusively affected merchants, shipping, everything else you can guess under those categories. If you were a farmer in the South or anywhere else, this had no impact on you. It had almost nothing at all to do with you, in fact. And so naturally, the higher orders of the colonies were very aggrieved by that. And they wanted to enlist the support of the lower orders to present a challenge to that because it was muscling in and it was taking a cut out of their business. Another thing, too, is you can see after the revolution was a significant loosening of commercial, if you can call it regulations or economic restrictions. I think everyone can remember those, and this was obviously much later after the revolution, but there's a clear line of succession in this. That everyone can remember those old heroin advertisements and opium advertisements for supposedly could cure this and do that. All kinds of scam products and nonsense back in the day. And frankly, to the British credit, uh, advertisements like that, while not perfect, were they tried to regulate them. They had moral commercial standards, which a lot of the people in the wake of the revolution did their utmost to overturn. And obviously, maybe today it's transformed into, as you said, calorie-free salad dressings and everything else, or gluten-free products. But the origins back to the merchants, the plutocratic power grab in the New England colonies is undeniable.
Yeah, and if you think about it, the distinct history, say, between the northern neighbor Canada and the United States, very different populations, very different motivations. Retrospectively, it almost seems that it might have been long term more beneficial for the United States to remain a commonwealth, possibly, at least up until comparatively recently. But yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're a plutocrat and you want to increase your profits, that's what you're going to do. To do, I wonder though at times how much of the rhetoric about these mythical figures is actually believed in it from an ideological perspective. I mean, certainly in libertarian strains. I mean, almost no one's really libertarian these days for kind of obvious reasons. But this idea that I don't know something happens politically, and then they'll make some statement to the effect of, "Well, the founding fathers are rolling in their graves," something like that. Um,
Yeah, I think enough time has finally elapsed technologically, socially, and politically to where they're not revered as much as they would be or looked to for answers and guidance in the writings. But I think you and I both can't deny that in previous decades that we both witnessed the reverence and the placed importance on these people was quite significant.
yeah, but also I'll point something out. And maybe I'm going off on a limb here, but given the information you provided, one could almost think that the founding fathers might not have only tolerated the actions that led to the 2008-9 housing crisis and Great Recession, but might have been lively and enthusiastic participants themselves had they been present.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, they were deeply in bed with the banks and everything else. I wouldn't necessarily go as that far, but yeah, I would say they exhibited similar behavior on that time scale. You at that time period, I should say. You introduced Canada a little bit while ago. I'd actually like to talk about that because it's a very good comparison. It's a tale of two separations from the British Empire, if that's fine with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so ultimately, and everyone knows this, both Canada and the United States separated from the British Empire, and they did it from two in two very radically different ways, right? So the United States went through a bloody, destructive, indebting revolution that significantly weakened and devastated the country. And Canada, in the meanwhile, maybe you could perhaps argue that the British learned from the example of the Americans that it's better to do a peaceful transition out of direct control. Regardless, though, the Canadians took the peaceful route and avoided the indebtedness, the estrangement, the casualties, the destructions, the chaotic political organizations. And there's, I hate to invoke GDP, but you can just see a clear line of succession, a peaceful transition as they were made more autonomous within the British system, and they maintained a coherent set of rule of law and remained wonderfully politically still intertwined. Whereas the United States extricated itself, if that's the right word, and went through a brief estrangement period before inevitably being forced to return to British alignment and British friendship anyway later, after decades of haphazard and chaotic diplomacy seeking friendship with the French, the Spanish, even the Russians at one point. It was even the Dutch, even. It was very chaotic. And I think it could be argued that the 13 colonies got very lucky in this. So beyond the plutocratic revolts, the founders didn't really have much of a view beyond that, and they were kind of grasping out in the dark what to do when they finally, surprisingly, did get independence. And a lot of historians make the argument that, similar to the oil-rich countries across the world, the United States got very lucky that it stumbled on and later acquired farmland that was on par with Ukraine. So, for example, some of the best farmland in the entire world it's viewed to be in Ukraine and in the United States, specifically in the Midwest. So, many historians, and I put myself in this camp too, also argue that the revolution was devastating and it would have permanently impoverished or permanently set behind compared to other British colonies had they not used the resources and reserves and land of the American continent, which are significant, and filled in that hole of damages caused by short-term short-sightedness, greed, and a desire for purposeless autonomy.
Yeah. So you're essentially making an argument that the United States
It
would
was
have.
the 1700s equivalent of fighting devastating war, having everything burned down, massive debt, and then stumbling on oil, and then just paying it off. It wasn't, the American boom after that. You can argue, yeah, obviously there was a lot of hard work and ingenuity and shrewd commercial practices that were done, but a lot of it too was that the resources and land of the American continent were incredible, and they managed to fill in the hole that the revolution burned into the 13 colonies.
Yeah, and I can't help but notice certain similarities between the plutocrats taking advantage of the common man. For example, Dick Cheney and his motivations in the early 2000s with respect to the Middle East and
Right. So in that
uh,
case, that would be foreign adventurism. At that time, though, all they had to do was say, "We'll settle further west and see what we can extract from
sure,
there."
sure, different
That's the
areas
only
of the world,
difference.
yeah. But
Yeah,
the similarity I find pretty remarkable nonetheless.
it is. Yeah, that's a fair comparison to draw.
So would you say that had the United States just gone down the Canadian route, ultimately, at least for some time, they would have been better off?
Yeah, there's not an argument. It just the Revolutionary War was incredibly destructive. This isn't taught, but the debt, the suffering, the various product and food crises that followed it was horrible. And again, the argument is that they just simply fell back on the resources of the continent to deal with that. Now, imagine if they hadn't done that, there had been a peaceful transition, not a sudden plutocratic power grab. The United States would probably be economically even further than it is today.
Well, you can just walk into a Walmart and buy an AR-15. That's, I guess, pretty powerful. No pun intended.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it cannot be denied that you have more quote unquote freedoms in the United States, even as a vestige of something in the past than other places in the world. That part can't be denied at all. But the argument I'm making and a lot of historians make is that those were temporary promises done to the lower orders because the plutocrats really, really, really wanted to establish their own turf. And to do that, they needed foot soldiers and they needed to make promises that were eroded over time later anyway by the wealthy and the powerful.
Yeah. But I mean, for the record, though, the First Amendment is pretty unique. There's no equivalent of that anywhere in the world, save in the United States. There are
Absolutely.
approximations, in Europe, but there are a couple exceptions to those. Canada, similar. So,
It was extraordinary times, and they needed to make huge promises to get people to fight the British without shoes and sometimes coats or rifles and hiding out in the forest freezing. They needed to make big promises to get people to sign up for it,
yeah, yeah. It's one thing to look at a painting of the frozen Delaware River. It's another thing to
to
actually,
experience it.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Terrible. Yeah. But I think that this history really lays bare a reality that I've always sensed about the United States is that it's rather soulless, and that, again, there's a continuity of sort of mercantile interests and just, despite what people claim, I realize that many parts of the United States are very religious, and I suppose you could call that spiritual. But this idea that the founding fathers were operating under sort of first order principles rather than some sort of pragmatic arrangement, as you have explained it, with respect to the lower classes and what have you. And this has been the case since time immemorial. That revolutionaries and various people, it was the same with the Russian Revolution, need to sort of harness the masses and take advantage of them because they need foot soldiers. It's becoming sort of less the case these days with digital media, obviously.
Yeah.
It's less necessary because of other means of manipulation. But for most of history, it's been that way. And we in the present sort of reinterpret a lot of this stuff as this desire to be munificent and generous and try to benefit everyone and maintain freedom. I mean, that might, in theory, be a sort of side effect of it, but it certainly wasn't the intention, right?
Yeah. And that obviously naturally leads to what you were talking about at the beginning. And after the establishment of the United States, frankly, an economic zone would not be enough to keep it together. There needed to be a story, and that story was cultivated quite well. And the reverence for the founding fathers and all these great stories. And but if you look at the reality behind it, you find a lot of, to their credit, well-educated, landed, uh, aristocratic, wealthy people. But at the same time, too, you can see clear political machinations. One comparison I love to draw is that George Washington, I think he had the temperament of a good Discord moderator, to use a very, very current example. Uh, the guy really just wanted to be respected and esteemed, and he was preferred by the Continental Congress over people like Benedict Arnold because he was reliable and did what the plutocrats and merchants said. He was even willing to turn on former soldiers who weren't paid and lead the Continental Army in putting it down. He was a really great tool, if you could call it, if I dare say, for people in power because he was reliable, didn't rock the boat, and did what they said. They even were comfortable enough to give him an almost dictatorial post after the revolution was won, which he turned down, which is again is a sign of his personality that he really just wanted his role. He wanted his esteem within the hierarchy, and he was very content to be the tool of New England plutocrats.
Reminds me
And
of Colin Powell a little bit, just a little bit.
yeah, many such examples you could draw.
You know. Yeah, and of course, you never learn this stuff in school. You probably, again, this is, full disclosure. I wouldn't claim to be an expert in history, but my knowledge of history is primarily medieval and ancient. But certainly in high school and yeah, before that, you don't learn any of this. I would imagine if one were to study American history at the university level, who knows what they're doing these days? I don't know. Maybe American history is just looking at movies
We
of,
have new national myths now. These ones have been replaced. We
yeah,
have a new national story,
yes, we all
and that's for
know.
another time.
That's for another time. We kind of. I was about to suggest that maybe American history is showing reels of Sesame Street and the Cookie Monster, but That's
Quite
well
literally.
benign.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but maybe for my generation, mm, had I been more of a student of sort of modern, early modern history as opposed to medieval, that they would have taught many of these things as well, say in the 90s. It's possible, I'd imagine. I I kind of strenuously avoided taking any history related to the United States, but yeah,
There was a time when it actually was hard to avoid. I remember, being compelled to write these essays in the early grades about the founding fathers, and you'd be required to find these books. And I remember now in hindsight, having read many history books and even primary source documents, they were so glowing and praising. And I would love to be able to read those again. It was so many years ago, unfortunately, but I would even almost characterize it as propaganda. I mean, clearly not propaganda. It's not in use anymore. We have new national stories, but back then it was quite strong and almost impossible to avoid.
yeah. And I think really the ultimate lesson from all of this is something that we see with some degree of continuity when nations or empires are formed. Whatever the actual circumstances might be, there's some emergent mythos that accompanies it. It becomes sort of the ideological banner for many generations to come until it unravels and then it gets replaced by something else. I think that it's not a perfect analogy, and I'm very wary of drawing too many analogies between Rome and contemporary United States because people kind of overdo it. But in the wake of the destruction of the Republic, I think you see a buckling of belief in many things, and I argue laid the seeds and the groundwork for just the empire just being dysfunctional long term. Other reasons for that too, but so many competing belief systems, so many different. I mean, different religious belief systems, cults, and things like that. And I see analogies between that time. It's a strange coincidence that yes, Christianity emerges this time as well. Oddly enough, one would think, but in contemporary times, we see many different related but divergent belief systems in various things. They don't necessarily, they wouldn't necessarily be described as perfectly religious per se, but nonetheless, they have certain these aspects. Because when you have national myths, or even foundational myths is probably a better way to put it, unravel over time, they need to be replaced by something, and usually you have this massive competition. Around the time of, say, Christianity, there were tons or dozens of other cults competing for the masses' belief and the masses' charity. And it just so happens that Constantine decided that it was politically expedient in the fourth century to take advantage of Christianity, and the rest is history. But I would say that in the current year, various strains of far left ideology are probably the biggest competitors, the biggest winners, and are soon to be victors if they're not already outright victors. And it will probably, for generations to come, establish a new founding mythology about what the United States is. Some kind of smorgasbord of a cultural melting pot that has thrown off the shackles of "quote unquote" white supremacy and slave owners or some such nonsense. But might last for a while too until the next incarnation of or unraveling of myths occurs. But it seems that foundational myths only can remain so stable for so long. Arguably, if you look at the long track of Christianity, particularly the Catholic Church, it had its run until the Reformation. I mean, Christianity still was intact, but many different disputes there, and it held for as long as it could until it couldn't hold anymore. So I think, if anything, we could observe a kind of cyclical nature to these things. That in the United States, the sort of founding father mythology was very prevalent for quite some time, and probably began to unravel rather rapidly in the latter part of the 20th century, until it comes full force to the current year, where very few people even believe that stuff, let alone are aware of the historical events and things that you mentioned. No, they've bought into a completely new ideology. So, yeah, I think this is just the long march of history. Nothing seems to really hold these foundational myths for too long, although in the case of Rome and the Catholic Church, it had a nice run. In the U.S., it was, I guess, roughly 200 years, give or take. Um, and then it just started to unravel. And I think it's fascinating, though, there's some people, and you might have observed this as well, who were participating in the military. I encountered some military guys a little while ago, very patriotic, who are speaking in first person plurals we, as in the United States. I don't think that's very common. I think that's a sort of a leftover from maybe military indoctrination, the kind of bonding rituals they engage in. But other than that, that's about it.
Yeah, I can't speculate on the we thing. I hear that from a lot of people from a lot of different countries. Appreciated the commentary on the Romans and earlier history. That definitely is your strong suit, and that was shining through again. Um, yeah, the founding fathers, I wouldn't say they were particularly great or particularly evil. Now having looked at so many areas and aspects of history, it was a quite ordinary plutocrats revolt. It's no different than if the merchants of Genoa had gone together for a conspiracy and then it gotten out of hand, and then briefly a new state was formed, or in this case, the United States, due to geographic reasons among others, persisted for quite some time. Uh, but there's nothing truly, historically speaking, exceptional or above the ordinary, both in terms of avarice, even greed, or being evil.
There almost never is. And
They weren't the demigods you were taught, and they weren't evil, evil, evil like they're being portrayed by some people today either. Quite in the middle, quite ordinary.
yeah, well, at least they existed. I have severe doubts about the existence of Romulus and Remus, but that's just my own take. And we know, at least factually, that the founding fathers were real.
Sure, they
Uh,
existed, but a lot of the stories told around them are
oh yeah, yeah.
just fabrications, flat out
Well,
fabrications. Even Abraham Lincoln,
yeah, I mentioned the
not a founding
one,
father, obviously.
the cherry tree, right? And George
Exactly,
Washington.
that's the main one.
He's he never lied, and so he was perfectly honest. And of course, this is told to embellish upon their already
Yeah,
sterling
same with Benjamin
reputation.
Franklin. I mean, I'll give the guy credit. He was a philanthropist, and there were quite a nice, very kind quotes attributed to him, and they probably were true. But economically, how this guy acted to accumulate his wealth was far from charitable.
Another point also to mention. I mean, this is a fact that most of the founding fathers were rather disdainful of conventional Christianity. I mean, they didn't think very much of it as practiced by
It's
the
a mixed
common folk.
bag, but yeah,
Yeah. Well,
more
I
than
mean,
the
certainly
average.
Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, which were probably the intellectual powerhouses, they were not. I mean, Jefferson famously edited out the miracles in the New Testament, and so even subsequently, there have been sort of myths that have sprung up that to suit the needs of whatever narrative that they were sort of super religious and super Christian or whatever. Some of them were obviously, but
I don't want the audience to take this as denigrating them. Again, I want to emphasize that historically speaking, they were quite within the ordinary, quite within the mainstream. There was nothing particularly evil about them, I would say. But I also want people to, if there is still any of this left, which I doubt, to take a little bit of the sparkly, starry eyes when looking back at this time.
yeah, it's perhaps a better way of describing early American history is not the emergence of a nation, but the emergence of a trade and economic zone.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think that was a great overview. I think to the extent some of my audience appreciates it, I hope they do. I think they will. And it was really interesting to hear this stuff. I'd heard some of this stuff, but again, my strong suit is not this period of time. So it's always good to get a perspective from somebody who's more learned on particular subjects. So I hope this was an interesting talk for you guys. And if I'm still alive, as always, I'll check you out later. And I thank my guests for joining me. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.